Maya Jackson sprawls on frigid asphalt, blood oozing from her split lip, her skirt shredded where Officer Victor Crane's thick fingers gripped it minutes ago. He looms over her, chuckling, certain she's just another helpless black woman he can torment. Sirens howl in the distance, ignored. Then Maya's gaze hardens and she mutters, "You'll regret that." Crane snorts, blind to the CIA badge tucked in her coat. What's coming will shatter his world, and hers, over weeks of unrelenting turmoil. How far will this spiral? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against corruption, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales ahead. Maya Jackson sat at a wobbly table in the grimiest dive bar this side of the crumbling Midwest city, the kind of place where the air smelled like stale beer and regret. Her fingers curled around a chipped glass, the amber liquid inside barely touched, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. She wore a tailored grey skirt and a plain blouse, nothing flashy, but it still marked her as an outsider among the stained work vests and frayed ball caps of the regulars. She was here on purpose, a temp worker at the old steel factory by day, a CIA agent by night, chasing whispers of a smuggling ring woven into the police department's rotten core. The bar was a hotspot for off-duty cops and their shady pals, the perfect place to listen, to watch, to blend. Her mission demanded it, and Maya never flinched from the grind. She adjusted her posture, keeping her back to the wall, her dark curls spilling over one shoulder as she pretended to sip the warm beer. The jukebox crooned a twangy tune, nearly drowned out by the clatter of pool balls and the low rumble of rough voices. She'd been in town for 5 days, long enough to map the streets, short enough to stay a ghost. Tonight, she was fishing for names, faces, anything to crack the case wide open. The door swung open with a groan, letting in a blast of cold autumn air that carried the scent of diesel from the factories 2 blocks over. 2 men strode in, their boots thudding against the sticky floor, their uniforms swapped for jeans and jackets, but their swagger screaming authority. Maya clocked them instantly. The bigger one, a mountain of muscle with a buzzed scalp and a jaw like a brick, was Victor Crane, a beat cop with a reputation for breaking more than just rules. His partner, Lyle Dunn, was wiry, sharp-eyed, with a smirk that could curdle milk. They scanned the room, their gazes landing on her like wolves spotting a lone deer. She kept her expression neutral, her hands still but her pulse ticked up a notch. She'd seen Crane's type before, men who wore their badges like crowns, who thought power came from pushing people down. This was the test she'd been waiting for. Crane sauntered over, his bulk casting a shadow across her table, Dunn trailing behind with a lazy grin. The bar's chatter dipped, eyes flicking their way, some with amusement, others with unease. Crane leaned down close enough for her to smell the tobacco on his breath, his meaty hand resting on the table's edge. "Well, look at this," he drawled, his voice loud enough to draw a few chuckles from the regulars. "Fancy skirt like that don't belong in a dump like this. What's a pretty little thing like you doing here all alone?" Maya met his stare, her brown eyes steady, her lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel the room shift, the air thickening with anticipation. "Just having a drink," she said, her tone flat, uninviting. Crane's grin widened, showing teeth yellowed from years of cheap coffee and cheaper smokes. "Oh, I bet you're here for more than that," he said, his fingers brushing the hem of her skirt, tugging at the fabric with a deliberate slowness that made her skin crawl. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, though every instinct screamed to snap his wrist. She was playing a part, the quiet temp who wouldn't fight back, and she played it well. The tear of fabric echoed in her ears as he yanked harder, ripping the hem a good 3 inches, exposing the edge of her knee. Dunn laughed, a sharp, barking sound, crossing his arms as he leaned against a nearby stool. "Big city fashion, huh? Bet that cost a pretty penny," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. The bar erupted in snickers, a few men nodding like this was the night's entertainment. Maya's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice low, controlled. "You done?" she asked, her gaze flicking between them. Crane straightened, wiping his hand on his jacket like he'd touched something dirty. "Not even close," he muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. "Stick around, sweetheart, we'll show you how we have fun around here." She let them walk away. Crane slapping Dunn's back as they headed to the bar, the crowd parting like they were royalty. Maya's fingers tightened around her glass, her mind racing. She memorized every detail. Crane's heavy gait, Dunn's twitchy fingers, the way the bartender poured their drinks without asking. She counted the faces that laughed, the ones that looked away, filing it all away for later. This wasn't just harassment, it was a power play, a signal she'd been noticed. She finished her beer in one slow gulp, stood and slipped out the back door into the alley, the cold biting at her bare arms. The night was quiet, the city's hum a distant drone, and she exhaled, thinking she'd dodged the worst of it. Her car, a beat-up sedan parked a block away, was her ticket out. She rounded the corner, her heels clicking on cracked pavement, and froze. All four tires were slashed, rubber sagging into puddles of rainwater, the cuts jagged and deep. Her breath caught, a chill snaking down her spine. She scanned the street, shadows shifting in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, but no one moved. This wasn't random. Crane's crew had marked her, sent a message in slashed rubber and torn fabric. She knelt beside the car, running her, fingers along the gashes, her mind already piecing it together. They'd watched her leave, waited for her to step out of sight. She stood, her torn skirt flapping in the breeze, and pulled her coat tighter. The bar's neon sign buzzed in the turnt. Distance, a taunting red glow against the black sky. She'd wanted intel and she'd gotten it, but at a cost. Crane wasn't just a loudmouth, he was a predator, and she'd stepped into his hunting ground. She started walking, her steps quick but steady, the weight of her CIA badge a silent anchor in her pocket. She thought she'd slipped away clean, but those tires told a different story. They knew where she parked. They'd be watching her next move. The city loomed around her, a maze of rusting steel and broken dreams, every corner hiding eyes that didn't care or hands that did worse. Maya's training kicked in, her senses sharpening as she mapped her route back to the cheap apartment she'd rented under a fake name. She stuck to the shadows, avoiding the main roads where patrol cars might prowl. The torn skirt chafed against her leg, a constant reminder of Crane's meaty grip, his mocking laugh. She could still hear it echoing in her skull, a sound that promised more than just words. She'd come here to dig up dirt, but she'd unearthed something uglier, something personal. Crane didn't just run this town, he owned it. And he'd decided she was his new toy. Her apartment was 3 miles away, a slog through streets littered with shattered glass and faded flyers. She kept her head down, her curls tucked under her hood, blending into the night as best she could. A stray dog barked somewhere nearby, its howl swallowed by the wind rattling through empty lots. She passed a group of men huddled around a barrel. Fire! Their faces gaunt, their eyes sliding over her without interest. She was invisible to them, but not to Crane. He'd made that clear. Her phone stayed in her pocket untouched. A call to her handler now would blow her cover, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. She needed more, something solid to bury him with. When she finally reached the apartment, her legs ached, her torn skirt damp with sweat and grime. The building was a sagging relic, its brick facade crumbling like the city itself. She climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under her weight, and unlocked her door with a key she'd taped under the mat. Inside, the place smelled of mildew and old paint, a single bulb flickering overhead. She locked the door, slid a chair under the knob and sank onto the lumpy couch, her breath steadying. She'd made it back, shaken but intact. The bar, the skirt, the tires, it was all a warning, a flex of Crane's muscle. She closed her eyes, replaying every second, every face. She thought she'd gotten out unscathed, that she could regroup and strike back. But as she drifted into a shallow sleep, the sound of a car engine growled outside her window, low and deliberate, circling the block. She snapped awake, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept under the cushion. The engine faded, but the message lingered. Crane wasn't done. He'd started something tonight, something that wouldn't end with a torn skirt or slashed tires. She stood peering through the blinds at the empty street below, her heart thudding against her ribs. The city was his playground, and she was the new game. She'd wanted to blend in, to listen, but she'd caught his eye instead. And in this town, that was the kind of mistake that didn't just cost you a night's sleep. It cost you everything. Maya Jackson pushed through the precinct's heavy glass doors the next morning, her torn skirt swapped for a pair of dark slacks, her jaw set like steel. The air inside smelled of burnt coffee and sweat, a mix that clung to the peeling beige walls and the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. She'd spent the night piecing together her plan, her mind replaying Crane's meaty fingers on her skirt, the slashed tires glinting under the street lamp. This wasn't just about gathering intel anymore, it was personal. She stepped up to the front desk, her boots clicking on the scuffed linoleum, and faced a bored clerk with a buzz cut and a badge pinned crooked on his chest. "I'm here to report vandalism," she said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on his. "Someone slashed my tires last night, I've got photos." She slid her phone across the counter, the screen glowing with shots of the shredded rubber, time-stamped just past midnight. The clerk barely glanced at it, his lips curling into a smirk as he tapped a pen against a clipboard. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, scribbling something she couldn't see. Before she could press him, a shadow loomed over her shoulder, and she caught the whiff of tobacco and arrogance. Victor Crane. He leaned against the desk, his buzzed scalp gleaming under the lights, his uniform stretched tight over his hulking frame. "Well, if it ain't Miss Fancy Skirt," he drawled, his voice loud enough to turn heads across the room. A few cops snickered from their desks, their eyes glinting with the same smugness she'd seen at the bar. "What's this about tires? You sure you didn't just park in the wrong spot and piss someone off?" Maya's fingers twitched, but she kept her cool, her training holding her steady. "I know what I saw," she said, her tone flat. "4 tires all cut, that's not an accident." Crane's grin widened, and he snatched the clipboard from the clerk, flipping through it like he owned the place. "Let me see here," he said, his pen scratching across the page. "Complainant claims vandalism, but no witnesses, no proof. Sounds like another troublemaker looking for attention, huh?" He looked up, his eyes boring into hers, daring her to push back. The room erupted in low chuckles, a chorus of agreement from his cronies. Maya's stomach twisted, not from fear but from the sheer gall of it. She was testing the system and it was failing right in front of her. "You're not even going to check it out?" she asked, her voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. Crane tilted his head, mock confusion on his face. "Check what out? Some black chick's sob story? We got real crimes to handle." The words hit like a slap, and the room's laughter swelled, a wave of scorn that made her skin prickle. She stood her ground, her gaze flicking to the other cops, cataloging their faces. A skinny guy with a mustache, a broad-shouldered woman chewing gum, all nodding like Crane was preaching gospel. He leaned closer, his breath hot on her face. "Tell you what," he said, grabbing a styrofoam cup of coffee from the desk. "I'll file this for you." Oops. His hand tilted, and the scalding liquid splashed across her chest, soaking her blouse, dripping onto her slacks. She jumped back, the heat searing her skin, but Crane just laughed, a grating bellow that echoed off the walls. "Guess you're troublemaking trash after all," he said, tossing the empty cup into a trash bin. "Get out of here before you make a bigger mess." Maya's fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms, but she turned and walked out, the precinct's jeers chasing her through the door. Her shirt clung to her, the coffee stain dark and humiliating, but her mind was already racing. This wasn't just corruption, it was a machine, oiled with racism and run by men like Crane. She'd expected resistance, but not this brazen. She wiped her hands on her pants, the autumn wind biting at her damp clothes as she headed back to her apartment, 3 miles of cracked sidewalks and sullen faces. She thought she'd rattled him, that reporting it would put him on edge. She was wrong. He'd turned it into a game, and she was the punchline. That night, the city's shadows stretched long and jagged, the sky a bruised purple over the industrial sprawl. Maya sat on her couch, the single bulb flickering above, her phone buzzing, with a text from her CIA handler. "Stay low, dig deeper." She nodded to herself, replaying Crane's smirk, the coffee spill, the way he'd twisted her words. She was about to grab a shower when a rustle outside her window stopped her cold. Footsteps, heavy and uneven, crunched on the gravel lot below. She crept to the blinds, peering through the slats, and saw three figures in hoodies, their faces masked by darkness. Her pulse spiked. She'd seen this before, the prelude to something ugly. Before she could move, a pipe smashed through her window, glass exploding inward, showering her with shards. She dove behind the couch as the men climbed through, their boots thudding on the floor. "Where's the little rat?" one growled, his voice thick with hate. Another swung a pipe at her lamp, shattering it, plunging the room into gloom. "Filthy, trash like you don't belong here," he spat, and the third lunged at her, his fist slamming into her shoulder. Maya rolled, pain blooming hot and sharp, and kicked out, catching his knee. He cursed, stumbling, but the others closed in, pipes, swinging. She ducked one blow, took another to her ribs, the crack of metal on bone stealing her breath. They were Crane's dogs, she knew it, sent to teach her a lesson. "Tell your kind to stay out," one shouted, his slurs slicing through the air. As he aimed for her head, she dodged, adrenaline surging, and grabbed a shard of glass, slashing at the nearest thug's arm. He yelped, blood spraying, and she bolted for the door, shoving past the second guy. Her ribs screamed, her shoulder throbbed, but she hit the stairs running, their curses echoing behind her. She burst into the street, weaving through alleys, the cold air stinging her lungs. Blood trickled from a cut on her cheek, her blouse torn where a pipe had grazed her. She ducked behind a dumpster, chest heaving, listening as their footsteps faded. She'd broken one's nose, maybe more, and gotten out alive. She thought she'd escaped, that she could lick her wounds and plan her next move. But when she limped back to her apartment an hour later, her key trembling in her hand, the door hung off its hinges. Inside, chaos reigned. Her couch was gutted, stuffing spilling like snow. Her laptop lay smashed, its screen a spider web of cracks. Drawers dangled open, clothes strewn across the floor, her spare skirt shredded into rags. A message scrawled in red marker glared from the wall. "Leave or die." Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a beating. It was a declaration. Crane hadn't just sent goons to rough her up. He'd torn her world apart. She sank to her knees, glass crunching under her, the weight of it crashing down. She'd thought she'd survived the night, but this was worse. They knew where she lived. They'd be back. Now, what do you think about Crane's dirty tricks? Drop a number 1 in the comments if you're raging at how he twisted Maya's report into a joke, and smash that like button if you're rooting for her to turn the tables. Subscribe if you're ready to see this corrupt cop get what's coming, because this story's just heating up. Can you believe he'd sink this low with that coffee stunt? Comment number 2 if you think Maya's got the guts to outsmart him. What's she going to do with her place trashed and Crane's crew hunting her down? Will she hit back harder, or is she in over her head? Stick around to find out. Maya Jackson crouched in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, her bruised ribs aching with every breath, her torn blouse swapped for a hoodie she'd scavenged from a thrift store bin. The city's industrial sprawl loomed around her, a jungle of rusting steel and shadowed alleys, the air thick with the tang of oil and despair. She'd spent the day after the ambush holed up in a crumbling motel 6 blocks from her wrecked apartment, its neon sign buzzing like a dying insect. Sleep hadn't come. Instead, she'd powered up a burner phone, its screen casting a cold light on her blood-streaked face. Her CIA-issued tech was slim but lethal, a tracking app that could ping burner phones within a mile radius. She'd memorized the voices from the alley, the slurs, the heavy thud of boots, and now she hunted them. Crane had sent those thugs and she'd make him pay. Her fingers danced across the screen, the app humming as it locked onto a signal from one of the attacker's phones, a cheap prepaid model pinging half a mile away. She traced it to a dive, bar 3 streets over, the same one where Crane had torn her skirt. Her lips curled into a grim smile, sloppy. She cross-referenced the signal with precinct records she'd hacked weeks ago, matching it to a lowlife named Eddie Voss, a known snitch with a rap sheet longer than the Mississippi. Voss had a burner, registered to his parole officer, and last night he'd been swinging a pipe at her head. The app showed him texting someone, a number tied to Crane's personal cell. "She's gone quiet," the message read. "Good," Crane replied. "Keep her that way." Maya's blood ran hot. She had him. She pulled her hood tighter, the autumn wind whipping through the alley as she slipped into a corner store. It's Clark, half asleep behind a plexiglass shield. She bought a disposable USB drive and a coffee, black and bitter, to steady her shaking hands. Back at the motel, she uploaded the phone logs, syncing them with audio from her hidden recorder, a tiny device she'd kept in her pocket during the bar incident. Crane's voice rasped through the static. "Fancy fabric. Bet it costs more than my whole wardrobe," followed by Dunn's laugh. She packaged it all, photos of her slashed tires, the texts, the audio, and emailed it anonymously to Carla Ortiz, a scrappy reporter at the city's last independent paper. Ortiz had a rep for digging into police dirt, and Maya knew she'd bite. By dawn, the story hit online. Local cop tied to vandalism, assault on black woman. Crane's name blazed in bold, and Maya sipped her coffee, a flicker of triumph warming her chest. The city buzzed with it all morning, factory workers whispering over their smokes, barflies muttering over their beers. By noon, the precinct caved under public pressure, suspending Crane pending investigation. Maya watched from a diner across town, her new safe house, a greasy spoon with cracked vinyl booths and a TV bolted to the wall. The news ticker scrolled. Officer Victor Crane sidelined after explosive allegations. She leaned back, her bruised shoulder throbbing, and let herself breathe. She'd hit him where it hurt, stripped his badge, his swagger. She pictured him fuming, his meaty fists clenched, and it felt good. Too good. She ordered a second coffee, the steam curling around her face, and thought she'd bought herself time to regroup, to dig deeper into the smuggling ring. She was wrong. Crane didn't sit still. Suspended didn't mean stopped, not in a town where cash flowed faster than justice. By 3 that afternoon, he'd slipped a wad of bills to a crooked sergeant, a grey-haired relic who'd looked the other way for decades. The sergeant called in a favor with a street dealer, a twitchy kid named Rico who owed half the force for keeping him out of lockup. Rico got the word, plant a baggie of white powder in a beat-up sedan parked near the diner. Crane knew it was hers. He'd had eyes on her since the tires. He'd waited, biding his time, letting her think she'd won. Rico did the job quick, sliding the drugs under the driver's seat while Maya ate her eggs inside, oblivious. Crane grinned from his truck 2 blocks away, his phone buzzing with updates. "She's done," he texted Dunn. "Watch this." Maya left the diner at 4, her hood up, her steps light for the first time in days. The sun hung low, painting the sky a dull orange over the factory smokestacks. She slid into her car, the engine coughing to life, and pulled onto the main drag, heading for a new hideout she'd scouted near the rail yards. She didn't get far. 2 blocks down, red and blue lights flared in her rear view. A patrol car, screeching up behind her. She cursed under her breath, easing to the curb, her mind racing. She hadn't sped, hadn't swerved. The officer tapped her window, a wiry guy with a buzz cut and a smirk she recognized from the precinct. "Step out." "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with fake courtesy. "Got a tip about this vehicle." She complied, her hands steady, her face blank. "What's this about?" she asked, but he didn't answer, just yanked open her door and started poking around. Her stomach dropped as he reached under the seat, pulling out a plastic bag stuffed with powder, holding it up like a trophy. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Looks like we got a dealer here." Maya's pulse hammered, her eyes narrowing. "That's not mine," she said, her voice sharp. But he was already cuffing her, his grip bruising her wrists. The crowd swelled, factory workers and shopkeepers spilling onto the sidewalk, their murmurs turning to cheers as he shoved her toward the patrol car. "About time they cleaned up this trash," someone yelled, the word black unspoken, but heavy in the air. Crane rolled up then, his truck idling at the corner, his window down just enough for her to catch his grin. "Thought you'd win, huh?" he called, his voice cutting through the noise. "Should have stayed out of my town." She twisted in the cuffs, her shoulder screaming from the alley, beating, but she locked eyes with him, her glare promising fire. The cop slammed her into the car, her cheek pressed against the cold metal, the crowd's jeers ringing in her ears. She'd exposed him, cost him his badge for a day, and he'd flipped it back on her with a frame-up so smooth she hadn't seen it coming. The precinct doors loomed ahead as they drove her in, her mind spinning. She'd thought suspension was a knockout punch, but Crane had danced around it, hit her harder. The holding cell stank of piss and bleach, a concrete box with a single flickering bulb. She sat on the bench, her wrists raw from the cuffs, her slacks stained with diner grease and street dirt. The crowd's cheers echoed in her skull, a soundtrack to her fall. She'd leaked the story, watched Crane squirm, and now she was the one locked up, the drugs a lie she couldn't shake. Her burner phone was still in her pocket, missed in the pat-down, a lifeline she couldn't use yet. She leaned back, the wall cold against her spine, and replayed every move. Crane's bribe, the dealer, the tip, it was all too clean. He'd played her, turned her win into a trap. She closed her eyes, the sting of coffee on her chest a ghost pain from yesterday, and knew this wasn't the end. He'd caged her, but she'd claw her way out. Maya Jackson sat on the cold steel bench of the holding cell, her wrists chafed red from the cuffs, her slacks stiff with dried coffee and street grime. The air reeked of mildew and despair, the flickering bulb overhead buzzing like a trapped fly. Her ribs throbbed from the alley beating, her shoulder a dull ache, but her eyes burned with focus. She'd been here 6 hours, the precinct a hive of sneers and whispers since Crane's frame-up landed her behind bars. The drugs in her car, a lie so blatant it stank, had turned her from accuser to accused in a heartbeat. She kept her burner, phone tucked against her thigh, its edges digging into her skin. A secret the sloppy pat-down had missed. Footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy and deliberate, and she straightened, her senses razor-sharp. 2 guards swaggered in, their uniforms wrinkled, their grins twisted with malice. The taller one, a lanky guy with a scar slicing his eyebrow, banged his baton against the bars. "Well, well, Crane's little toy," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Thought you'd snitch and walk away, huh?" The shorter one, broad and sweaty, stepped closer, his breath sour with chew. "Look at her, all dressed up like she's somebody," he mocked, reaching through the bars to grab her slacks. His fingers snagged the fabric where her skirt had been days ago, tearing it wider, exposing her knee. "Ain't so fancy now, are ya?" Maya's jaw clenched, her hands itching to snap his wrist, but she stayed still, her gaze icy. "Back off," she said, low and firm. They laughed, a harsh guttural sound that bounced off the concrete. "Or what, trash?" the lanky one spat, slamming the baton again. "You're nothing here." They lingered, tossing slurs like grenades, each word a jab at her skin, her blood, her existence. She memorized their faces, their badges, Scarface and Chew, filing them away with Crane's crew. She'd been trained for this, to endure, to outlast, but the humiliation burned hotter than the coffee he'd spilled. After 10 minutes, they sauntered off, their laughter fading down the corridor. Maya exhaled, her fingers brushing the burner phone. She waited, counting the seconds, until the precinct's hum dulled to a murmur. Then she texted her CIA handler, a coded message. "Framed. Need extraction now." She deleted it fast, her heart thudding, knowing every second in this cage was a gamble. 2 hours later, the cell door clanked open, and a stern woman in a cheap suit marched in, her heels clicking like gunfire. "Maya Thompson," she barked. Her voice clipped. It was a fake name, one of many, and Maya nodded, rising stiffly. "You're out, bail posted. Let's move." The woman flashed forged papers, a slick CIA cover, and the desk sergeant barely glanced at them, too busy chewing their donut to care. Maya followed her out, the precinct's stale air giving way to the crisp bite of dusk. The woman, Agent Reese, handed her a burner with a single instruction. "New safe house, lay low." Maya took it, her mind already spinning. She was free, the frame-up dodged, Crane's trap sprung. She thought she'd bought herself breathing. Room? She was dead wrong. She met Carla Ortiz at a derelict gas station 10 blocks away, the reporter's hands trembling as she clutched a thermos of tea. Her dark eyes darted around, her coat singed at the hem. "They torched my office," Carla whispered, her voice cracking. "Crane's guys, right after the story ran. I barely got out." Maya's stomach twisted, the triumph from his suspension, souring fast. "You're sure it was him?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Carla nodded, pulling her coat tighter. They left a note. Snitches burn. I can't print anything else, Maya. I'm done. The reporter's fear was a mirror to the city's rot, and Maya felt it sink into her bones. She dragged Carla in, and Crane had struck back harder, faster. She sent the woman off with a promise to fix it, but the weight of that vow pressed heavy on her chest. Night fell, the city's skyline a jagged scar against the moonless sky. Maya holed up in the new safe house, a cramped attic above a pawn shop, its windows boarded, its air thick with dust. She sat on a cot, her burner buzzing with updates from Reese. Crane's on the move, stay put. She nodded to herself, peeling off her torn slacks, the fabric a shredded relic of the guard's taunts. She thought she'd outmaneuvered him. That suspension and Carla's story had clipped his wings. Then the floor trembled, a low rumble growing into a roar. She leapt to the window, prying a board loose, and saw flames licking the street below. A mob, 20 strong, surged toward the shop, their faces twisted with hate, Crane at the helm. He stood in the glow of a street lamp, his buzzed scalp gleaming, a Molotov cocktail in his hand. "You're nothing here," he bellowed, his voice a thunderclap over the crowd's chants. He lit the rag, the flame dancing wild, and hurled it through the pawn shop's window. Glass shattered, fire blooming fast, the mob cheering as bottles flew. Maya grabbed her bag, her lungs seizing as smoke clawed its way up the stairs. She bolted for the attic window, wrenching it open, the heat searing her back. She climbed out, her ribs screaming, and dropped onto a dumpster 10 feet below, the impact jarring her bones. Flames roared behind her, the shop collapsing in a storm of sparks, her safe house gone. She stumbled into an alley, coughing, her hoodie singed, her slacks dangling in tatters. The mob's shouts faded, but Crane's voice lingered, a promise of more. She'd slipped his grasp in the cell, thought freedom was her win, but he'd turned it into ash. Her burner buzzed in her pocket, Reese's text stuck. "He's off the grid, watch your back." Maya leaned against a brick wall, the cold soaking into her, her breath ragged. The city was his, and he'd burn it down to prove it. She'd dodged his frame-up, but this was war now, personal and primal. Her safe house was cinders, her ally silenced, and Crane was just getting started. What's your take on this madness? Drop a number 1 in the comments if you think Crane's gone too far torching Maya's hideout, and hit that like button if you're cheering her escape from that inferno. Subscribe if you're hooked on seeing this racist cop face. The music, because it's only getting wilder. Think those guards crossed a line ripping her clothes? Comment number 2 if you're betting Maya's got a plan to make them regret it. How's she going to strike back with no safe place left? Will she outsmart Crane's mob, or is this fire just the start of her downfall? Stay tuned to find out. Maya Jackson crouched in the grimy shadows of a condemned motel, the air thick with mold, and the faint buzz of a dying neon sign flickering vacancy outside. Her hoodie was charred at the edges, her slacks reduced to tatters from the firebombing, her ribs a throbbing mess of bruises beneath. The city's industrial sprawl hummed beyond the cracked window, a beast that never slept, its factories belching smoke into the bruised night sky. She'd escaped Crane's mob by a hair, the flames of her safe house still searing her memory, his voice roaring through the chaos. She sat cross-legged on the stained carpet, a stolen laptop balanced on her knees, its screen glowing with hacked feeds from the precinct's security cameras. Her CIA training had taught her to turn desperation into a weapon, and tonight she'd wield it like a blade. Her fingers flew across the keys, bypassing firewalls with a precision that belied her battered state. She'd tapped into the system weeks ago, planting backdoors for moments like this. The feeds flickered to life, grainy images of the precinct's bullpen, the holding cells, the parking lot. She scanned them, her pulse steady, searching for Crane. She needed something big, something undeniable to bury him deeper than suspension could. Hours ticked by, the motel's walls creaking with every gust of wind, until she froze. There he was in the interrogation room, his bulk filling the frame. A black teenager, no older than 16, sat cuffed to a chair, his face swollen, blood trickling from his nose. Crane loomed over him, his fist slamming into the kid's jaw, the sound muffled but brutal through the feed. "You think you're tough, huh?" Crane snarled, his voice a low growl. "This town's mine, boy." Maya's stomach churned, her grip tightening on the laptop. She hit record, capturing every second, every punch, every slur that spilled from his mouth. The kid whimpered, his head lolling, and Crane grabbed his shirt, shaking him like a rag. Dull. "Next time, you'll stay out of my streets," he spat, landing a final blow before storming out. The footage ran for 6 minutes, a raw, unfiltered glimpse of the monster she was fighting. She saved it, encrypted it, and sent it to an FBI contact she'd cultivated months ago, a grizzled agent named Hollis, who'd promised to act if the evidence was airtight. "Crane beating minor, precinct cam 3, time-stamped," she typed, attaching the file. She leaned back, her breath shallow, a grim satisfaction settling in. This wasn't just a jab, it was a haymaker. By morning, the city buzzed with whispers, the FBI descending like hawks. Maya watched from a rooftop across from the precinct, her stolen binoculars pressed to her eyes, the autumn wind tugging at her singed hood. Black SUVs lined the street, agents in crisp suits hauling Crane in for questioning. His buzzed scalp gleamed under the sun as he stumbled out, hands cuffed, his face a mask of fury. She grinned, her split lip stinging, the sight sweeter than the coffee she'd lost in the fire. Hollis had moved fast, the video sparking a federal probe that even Crane's bribes couldn't dodge. She watched him squirm, barking at the agents, his voice drowned by the slam of car doors. She thought she'd landed the killing blow, that this would stick. She'd underestimated him again. Crane didn't stay down. By noon, his lawyer, a slick suit with City Hall ties, found a technicality, a glitch in the chain of custody for the footage. The cuffs came off, and he walked out, his grin wider than ever. A predator back on the hunt. Maya's stomach sank, her binoculars trembling in her hands. She'd hit him hard, but he'd slipped the net, his power deeper than she'd feared. She retreated to the motel, her mind racing, replaying the footage in her head. She'd thought the FBI would lock him up, give her time to breathe. Instead, he turned it back on her, fast and ruthless. That afternoon, wanted posters plastered the city, her face glaring from every pole and storefront. Maya Jackson, armed and dangerous, wanted for assaulting a minor, they read, the same teen from the video now pinned on her. Her breath caught, the lie so bold it stunned her. Crane had flipped the script, doctored records, maybe paid the kid's family to point the finger. She was a fugitive now, her cover blown, her mission a public target. She ditched the motel, her footsteps quick on the cracked pavement, the city's eyes suddenly everywhere. She slipped into a crowded market, the air thick with the scent of fried dough and diesel, her hood pulled low. Vendors hawked wares, kids darted through the throng, and she wove between them, her heart pounding. She thought she'd blended in, that she could vanish until Hollis regrouped. Then a shadow loomed behind her, a man in a leather jacket, his hand slipping to his belt. Bounty hunter. She caught the glint of a gun, the twitch of his smirk, and knew Crane had upped the ante. She ducked behind a fruit stand, apples tumbling as she moved, her ribs screaming with every twist. The hunter followed, his boots loud on the cobblestones, his voice a low hiss. "Gotcha, lady," he called, drawing his pistol. The crowd parted, gasps rippling through, but no one helped. She bolted, weaving through stalls, her arm brushing a stack of crates that crashed in her wake. He fired, the shot cracking through the market, grazing her left arm, blood blooming hot and fast. She stumbled, pain searing, but kept running, her breath ragged. She dove into an alley, the hunter's curses fading as she pressed against a high brick wall, her hand clamping the wound. Blood dripped onto the pavement, her vision blurring, but she stayed upright, her training kicking in. She'd sent Crane to the wolves, watched him squirm, and thought she'd won. Now she was the prey, her face on every screen, her blood staining the street. She tore a strip from her hoodie, wrapping her arm, the fabric soaking red. Crane hadn't just slipped free. He'd turned the city into his weapon, a manhunt with her as the prize. She staggered deeper into the alley, the market's noise a distant roar, her burner buzzing in her pocket. She didn't check it. Couldn't. Risk the light. She'd thought the video was her ace that justice would hold. Instead, it had unleashed a storm, and Crane was the lightning. Her arm throbbed, her safe house ash, her allies silent. She'd hit him, and he'd hit back harder. A bounty on her head proof he'd never stop. Maya Jackson limped through the city's underbelly, her arm throbbing where the bounty hunter's bullet had grazed her. The makeshift bandage soaked crimson beneath her charred hoodie. The industrial sprawl loomed, its smokestacks clawing at a grey dawn sky, the air heavy with ash and defeat. Her face was everywhere now, wanted posters stapled to telephone poles, flashing on pawn shop TVs, a grainy mugshot from her arrest twisted into a lie. Armed and dangerous, they screamed, branding her the villain in Crane's twisted play. She'd hit him with the FBI probe, thought she'd gained ground, but he'd turned the city into a noose, tightening with every step. She ducked into a storm drain, the damp concrete cold against her palms, her breath shallow as she listened for boots or sirens. By noon, the streets buzzed with something uglier than a manhunt. Crane had rallied his faithful, a crowd of factory workers and barflies, gathered in a vacant lot near the steel mill, their faces flushed with beer and hate. Maya watched from a rusted fire escape 2 blocks away, her stolen binoculars trembling in her hands. Crane stood on a makeshift stage, his buzzed scalp gleaming under the sun, a projector flickering behind him. Her face loomed large on the screen, the same photo from the posters, her eyes dark and defiant. "This is the Black Plague infecting our city," Crane roared, his voice booming over the cheers. "She attacked one of our own, a kid, and thinks she can hide." The crowd erupted, fists pumping, slurs flying like shrapnel. Maya's stomach churned, her fingers tightening on the metal railing. He paced the stage, his uniform swapped for a flannel shirt, playing the everyman while his words dripped venom. "We don't need her kind here stirring trouble, snitching to the feds," he shouted, and the mob howled, a sea of rage fed by lies. She saw it clear as day. Crane wasn't just dodging justice, he was rewriting it, painting her as the enemy, to shield his rot. She slipped the binoculars into her pocket, her mind racing. She couldn't run forever, not with her name a curse on every tongue. She needed leverage, something to flip this circus back on him. The factory loomed a mile away, its smokestacks a beacon. She'd heard whispers of his smuggling deals there, cash and guns moving under the cover of steel. If she could catch him in the act, she'd have him cold. She moved at dusk, her hoodie pulled low, her steps silent on the cracked pavement. The factory was a hulking relic, its windows shattered, its walls streaked with rust. She slipped through a loading dock, the air thick with oil and metal, her arm throbbing as she climbed a rickety ladder to the catwalk. Below, workers shuffled steel beams, their shouts echoing, but she wasn't here for them. She pulled a handful of tiny bugs from her bag, CIA tech no bigger than a dime, and planted them along the pipes, their mics humming to life. She synced them to her burner, the audio crackling through an earpiece. Hours passed, her legs cramping, until Crane's voice cut through the static. "We're cleaning the streets tonight," he bragged, his tone smug. "Cash comes in, guns go out. That rat won't stop us." Maya's pulse spiked, her breath catching. She recorded every word, his confession to the smuggling ring spilling out like gold. She crouched lower, the catwalk creaking, her mind alight with possibility. This was it, the nail in his coffin. She'd send it to Hollis, let the feds swarm again, finish what the video started. She thought she'd struck gold, that she'd outsmarted him this time. But Crane wasn't dumb. He'd rigged the factory with his own eyes, a tech-savvy lackey named Pete, who'd swept for bugs after a tip from a snitch. Pete found hers within an hour, tracing the signal back to her burner's faint ping. Crane didn't just destroy them, he turned them into a weapon. By midnight, the city's screens lit up again, but not with her mugshot. Crane broadcast live from the lot, his grin feral, her burner's location pulsing on a map for all to see. "She's hiding here," he bellowed, pointing to a blinking dot near the factory. "This plague thinks she can spy on us, but we're done playing." The crowd roared, a mob armed with bats and chains spilling into the streets, their chants, a war cry. Maya heard them coming, their boots pounding the pavement, their voices a rising tide of hate. She bolted from the catwalk, her arms screaming as she hit the ground, her bag bouncing against her hip. She thought she'd vanish into the night, that the recording was her shield. She was wrong. They swarmed the factory district, a pack of 50, their faces twisted with fury. Crane leading from his truck, a megaphone in hand. "Drag her out," he shouted, and the mob obeyed, smashing windows, kicking in doors. Maya ran, her lungs burning, her legs pumping through alleys thick with shadows. She ducked behind a dumpster, her breath ragged, the recording still buzzing in her earpiece. Bats clanged against metal, chains rattled, voices screamed her name like a curse. She peeked out, saw them closing in, their eyes wild, their weapons gleaming under streetlights. Crane's truck rolled closer, his laugh cutting through the chaos. "You're mine now," he called, and a bottle shattered inches from her head, glass raining down. She darted again, her sneakers slipping on wet pavement, the mob's roar deafening. She wove through a maze of shipping crates, her arm bleeding through the bandage, her ribs a firestorm of pain. She thought she'd lost them, that she could hole up and send the audio before they found her, but Crane's tech guy had locked her signal, feeding it live to the horde. They cornered her in a dead-end alley, their shadows stretching long and menacing. She pressed against a brick wall, her chest heaving, the recording her only weapon, useless now. The mob closed in, bats raised, chains swinging, Crane's truck idling at the mouth, his grin a promise of pain. She'd thought she'd trapped him, but he'd turned her move into a hunt, and she was the prey. How's this hitting you? Drop a number 1 in the comments if you're boiling over Crane turning Maya's fight into a public witch hunt, and smash that like button if you're on her side as she dodges this mob. Subscribe if you're gripped by this battle against corruption, because it's about to get crazier. Think she was smart to plant those bugs, or did she underestimate Crane's reach? Comment number 2 if you're betting she's got one more trick up her sleeve. What's she going to do with a whole city turned against her? Can she slip this trap, or is Crane's hate mob about to crush her? Keep watching to see how it unfolds. Maya Jackson pressed her back against the alley's brick wall, her breath shallow, her arm a pulsing mess of blood and pain beneath her shredded hoodie. The mob loomed, 50 strong, their shadows jagged under the streetlights, bats and chains glinting like teeth in the dim glow. Crane's truck idled at the alley's mouth, his buzzed scalp a silhouette against the headlights, his laugh a jagged edge cutting through their chants. "Get her!" he roared, and the crowd surged, a tidal wave of hate crashing toward her. She clutched a shard of glass from the bottle that had missed her head, her knuckles white, her ribs screaming from the factory sprint. She'd planted bugs, thought she'd outsmarted him, but Crane's tech had turned her into a beacon, and now she was trapped. The first man lunged, a burly factory worker with a bat raised high, his eyes wild with fury. She ducked, the wood splintering against the wall, and slashed his thigh with the glass, blood spraying hot across her hand. He howled, stumbling, but 2 more took his place, chains whipping through the air. One caught her shoulder, metal biting, deep, and she staggered, pain exploding white behind her eyes. "Filthy rat!" a woman shrieked, swinging a pipe at her legs. Maya rolled, the blow grazing her shin, and kicked out, toppling the woman into the crowd. They closed in tighter, boots stomping, fists flying, their slurs a deafening roar. She fought, her training a blur of instinct, but there were too many, their rage too raw. A bat slammed into her ribs, the crack of bone audible over the chaos, and she hit the ground, asphalt cold and gritty against her cheek. Blood pooled from her mouth, her vision swimming, but she kept moving, crawling through legs, slashing at anything she could reach. Crane watched, his laugh booming, his truck's engine a low growl. "Finish her!" he bellowed, and the mob obeyed, stomping her back, her arms, her head. Pain swallowed her, a black tide pulling her under, but she faked it, going limp, her eyes slitted as she waited. They slowed, their cheers turning to grunts, thinking her done. She felt a boot nudge her side, heard a man spit, "She's out!" And then they turned, crowing victory. Maya moved fast, her body screaming, adrenaline her only fuel. She rolled under a crate, her hand finding a knife she'd taped to her ankle days ago, a last-ditch play. She slashed a man's calf as he strutted away, his scream piercing the night, and bolted, weaving through the thinning crowd, Her ribs were fire, her legs jelly. But she hit an alley, the mob's shouts fading behind her. She thought she'd lost them, that she'd vanish into the city's maze. She limped 2 miles, her breath ragged, blood dripping a trail she couldn't hide. An abandoned warehouse loomed ahead, its windows boarded, its doors rusted shut. She pried one open, slipping, inside the air thick with dust and decay. She collapsed against a wall, her chest heaving, thinking she'd bought time to breathe, to plan. The warehouse was a tomb, its silence a stark contrast to the mob's roar. Broken machinery loomed like skeletons, shadows stretching long across the cracked concrete. She tore another strip from her hoodie, wrapping her ribs, the fabric sticking to her bloodied skin. Her arm throbbed, the bullet grazed a raw wound, but she forced herself to stand, pacing the space, her mind racing. She'd escaped death, left the mob crowing over nothing. She thought she'd slipped Crane's grasp, that the tracker they'd used was fried in the chaos. She was wrong. Back at the precinct, when they'd cuffed her, Crane had slipped a tiny GPS dot into her sneaker's sole, a move so subtle she'd missed it. He'd been playing her since the cell, and now he knew exactly where she hid. She'd barely caught her breath when the warehouse doors rattled, a low thud echoing through the cavernous space. Her pulse spiked, her hand tightening on the knife. Headlights pierced the gloom, beams slicing through the boards, and Crane's truck rolled in, flanked by 4 armed cronies, their guns glinting in the light. He stepped out, his boots loud on the concrete, his grin feral. "Thought you'd run, huh?" he called, his voice bouncing off the walls. "You don't get away that easy." The cronies fanned out, their weapons raised, and Maya dove behind. A rusted press, her heart hammering. She'd thought the mob was the worst, that she'd survived his wrath. This was worse. Gunfire erupted, bullets ripping through the air, punching holes in the metal around her. She crawled, her ribs a furnace of pain, her knife useless against automatics. "Find her!" Crane barked, his voice a whip cracking over the chaos. A crony rounded the press, his shotgun swinging, and she lunged, slashing his wrist, the gun clattering free. He cursed, clutching the wound, but another took his place, firing wild. A bullet grazed her thigh, blood blooming fast, and she bit. Back a scream, scrambling through a vent in the wall. The metal was tight, scraping her wounds, but she pulled herself through, tumbling onto the other side, a loading bay thick with shadows. She staggered to her feet, her vision spotting the gunfire, a relentless drum behind her. Crane's voice roared, "She's bleeding out, finish it!" She limped to a stack of crates, her breath hitching, her body a map of pain. She'd thought the alley was her breaking point, that she'd slipped his noose, but the tracker, a devil's gift from days ago, had led him straight to her. Bullets punched through the vent, ricocheting off steel, and she dove again, crawling under a conveyor belt, her blood slicking the floor. She reached a side door, wrenching it open, and stumbled into the night. The warehouse, a war zone at her back. The city swallowed her, its cold air a slap against her fevered skin. She pressed a hand to her thigh, blood seeping through her fingers, her ribs a cage of agony. She'd escaped again, barely, the knife still clutched in her trembling hand. Crane's cronies shouted inside, their shots fading as she hobbled into an alley, her sneakers squishing with every step. She thought she'd lost them, that she could vanish into the sprawl. But Crane's truck engine revved, a predator's growl, and she knew he'd hunt her to the end. She'd survived the mob, the guns, the blood, but the tracker was his ace, and it wouldn't let her go. Maya Jackson crouched in the shadows of a derelict rail yard, her body a tapestry of pain, her thigh oozing blood through a ragged bandage torn from her hoodie. The night was thick with the scent of rust and oil, the city's industrial sprawl, a jagged silhouette against a moonless sky. Her ribs ached with every breath, her arm a throbbing mess from the bounty hunter's graze, but her eyes burned with resolve. She'd escaped Crane's warehouse ambush by inches, the tracker in her sneaker a ticking bomb she'd ditched in a dumpster 2 miles back. Now she was the hunter. She'd overheard his smuggling brag on the factory bugs before he'd turned, them against her, and tonight she'd strike. The rail yard buzzed with activity, a clandestine drop under the cover of midnight. She perched on a rusted boxcar, her stolen camera gripped tight, its lens trained on a loading dock 50 yards away. Crane's crew moved fast, unloading crates from a black van, their voices low but sharp. She zoomed in, capturing stacks of cash bundled in plastic, handguns gleaming in the dim light of a flickering flood lamp. Crane strutted among them, his buzzed scalp catching the glow, his meaty hands barking orders. "Move it! We're on a clock!" he snapped, oblivious to her lens. She snapped photo after photo, her heart pounding, the evidence piling up like gold. This wasn't just a bust, it was his ruin, a smuggling ring tied to his name in vivid color. She slid the camera's memory card into her burner phone, her fingers, trembling but precise, and uploaded the files to a secure CIA server, a digital vault beyond Crane's reach. "Smuggling drop rail yard, Crane confirmed," she typed, hitting send. The upload bar crept forward, her breath hitching as headlights flared in the distance. She ducked lower, the van's engine growling as it peeled out, the crew scattering. She'd done it. Caught him red-handed, the kind of proof Hollis and the feds couldn't ignore. She slipped off the boxcar, her thigh screaming, and hobbled to a diner 3 blocks away, its neon sign a faint beacon in the gloom. She sank into a booth, her bloodied hoodie swapped for a stolen jacket, and ordered tea, the warmth seeping into her shaking hands. By dawn, the city erupted. She watched from the diner's cracked TV, the news ticker blazing. Officer Victor Crane arrested in smuggling raid, live footage. The screen cut to him, cuffed and snarling, dragged from his truck by federal agents in black vests. His flannel shirt was rumpled, his face a mask of rage as cameras flashed. "This is a setup," he bellowed, but the anchors cut to her photos, cash and guns splayed across the rail yard dock. Maya sipped her tea, the steam curling around her. Bruised face, a flicker of triumph warming her chest. She'd ambushed him, turned his empire into a headline, and this time it stuck. She thought it was over, that the feds had him locked tight. She was wrong again. Crane didn't stay caged. By noon, his allies in City Hall, a cabal of suits with deep pockets, pulled strings. A judge, bought years ago with dirty cash, signed his release, citing insufficient probable cause despite the photos. He walked out of lockup, his grin feral. The news cutting to him shaking hands with a councilman on the precinct steps. Maya's tea went cold, her stomach sinking as the ticker scrolled. Crane freed, investigation stalled. She'd hit him with everything, watched him fall, and he'd clawed back up, his power a hydra she couldn't kill. She leaned back, her ribs a dull ache, thinking she'd still crippled him, slowed his game. Then her burner buzzed, a video call from an unknown number, and her world tilted. She answered, her breath catching as Naya's face filled the screen. Her 19-year-old sister gagged with duct tape, tears streaking her cheeks. She was tied to a chair, her college dorm's posters a blurred backdrop, the room trashed. Crane's voice rasped through, off-camera but unmistakable. "You thought you'd win, huh?" he said, his tone a venomous purr. "She dies unless you vanish. Drop it all or I cut her slow." The call cut out, Nia's muffled sob echoing in Maya's skull. Her hands shook, the tea spilling across the table, her triumph ash in her mouth. She'd taken his operation, but he'd taken her family, a blow so personal it carved her hollow. She stumbled from the diner, the city a blur of steel and smoke, her mind racing. Nia was 2 hours away, a freshman at a state college, her life a world apart from this war. Crane had tracked her, struck where Maya couldn't shield her. She replayed the arrest, his snarl, the councilman's handshake. He'd planned this, a failsafe to gut her if she pushed too far. She'd thought the feds were her checkmate, that his cuffs were the end. Now Nia's life hung on her next move, and Crane held the knife. She hobbled to a payphone, her thigh a firestorm, and dialed Reese, her voice a whisper. "He's got my sister, I need help." The line crackled, Reese's reply grim. "We're stretched thin. You're on your own for now." Maya hung up, her chest tight, the city's hum a mocking drone. She'd ambushed his drop, watched him fall on live TV, and thought she'd won the war. But Crane had turned it personal, his retaliation a blade at Nia's throat. She sank against the booth, blood seeping through her bandage, her ribs a cage of pain. She'd crippled his smuggling, but he'd crippled her soul, and the fight was far from over. How's this twist landing with you? Drop a number 1 in the comments, if your stunned, Crane went after Maya's sister. And hit that like button if you're rooting for her to save Nia from this monster. Subscribe if you're locked into this fight against corruption, because the stakes just got personal. Was Maya's rail yard ambush worth the cost, or did she push Crane too far? Comment number 2 if you think she'll risk everything to get Nia back. What's her next play with Crane holding her sister? Hostage? Will she trade her mission for Nia's life, or is there a way to strike back harder? Stick around to see how this unfolds. Maya Jackson stood in the shadow of a derelict factory, its rusted walls looming like a fortress of decay, the air thick with the stench of oil and abandonment. Her thigh burned beneath a fresh bandage, her ribs a jagged ache, her arm a throbbing mess from days of blood and bullets. Nia's terrified face haunted her, the video call's static sob a knife in her gut. Crane had her sister, a pawn in his game, and Maya had no choice. She dialed the number he'd sent, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "Let her go," she'd said, "I'll come to you." His laugh had crackled through a predator's glee. Midnight, factory on 6th, alone, or she's meat. Now she waited, her burner buzzing with his coordinates, her heart a drumbeat of dread. The factory's loading bay gaped open, a maw of darkness lit by a single flood lamp. Crane's truck rolled in at midnight sharp, its engine a low growl, dust swirling in its wake. Nia stumbled out, shoved by a crony, her hands bound, her gag soaked with tears. Maya stepped forward, her hoodie limp around her battered frame, her eyes locked on her sister. "I'm here," she called, her voice cutting through the night. Crane emerged, his buzzed scalp gleaming, a crowbar swinging in his meaty hand. "Smart move," he sneered, nodding to the crony who cut Nia's ropes. The girl ran, sobbing, and Maya caught her, her arms trembling as she hugged her tight. "Go," she whispered, pushing Nia toward the street. "Don't look back." Nia fled, her footsteps fading, and Maya turned to face Crane, her chest hollow but resolute. He didn't waste time. "How you think your CIA tricks scare me?" he growled, swinging the crowbar fast. It slammed into her left arm, the bone snapping with a sickening crunch, and she dropped, pain blinding her. She rolled, her training kicking in, but he was relentless, his boot crashing into her ribs, reigniting the fractures from the mob. "You're nothing," he roared, the crowbar arcing again, clipping her jaw, blood spraying across the concrete. She spat, her vision swimming, her good hand scrabbling for leverage. He towered over her, his grin feral, the flood lamp casting him as a giant of hate. "Should have vanished," he said, raising the bar for a final blow. She thought Nia was safe, that her sacrifice had won. She was half right. Chaos erupted as Nia's scream pierced the night. The girl hadn't run far. She'd grabbed a pipe from the factory floor, her fear turning to fury. She charged, swinging wild, the metal cracking against Crane's knee. He bellowed, stumbling, and Maya seized the moment, lunging with her unbroken arm. She snatched the pipe from Nia, slamming it into Crane's skull, the thud a dull echo in the bay. He crumpled, his eyes rolling back, blood trickling from his temple. "Run!" Maya shouted, shoving Nia toward the exit again. This time, Nia obeyed, sprinting. Into the dark, her sobs a fading wail. Maya staggered after her, her fractured arm dangling, her jaw a furnace of pain, thinking they'd both escaped. She limped a mile, her breath ragged, blood dripping from her chin, the city's sprawl a blur of steel and shadows. Nia was ahead. Safe? Her silhouette vanishing around a corner. Maya reached a gas station, its pumps rusted, its lights dim, and sank against a wall, her body a wreck. She'd knocked Crane out, saved her sister, thought she'd bought them freedom. Her burner buzzed, Reese's voice crackling through. "Nia's with a unit, we're coming for you." Relief flooded her, a fragile thread in the storm. She closed her eyes, the pipe still clutched in her good hand, its weight a lifeline. She'd faced him down, taken his worst, and walked away. But Crane wasn't finished. He woke 10 minutes later, his head pounding, blood matting his buzzed hair. Rage fueled him, his knee a dull ache as he staggered to his truck, his cronies long gone. He'd lost Nia, but he'd break Maya for it. He'd planted a backup, a call he'd made hours ago to a demolition guy who owed him big. The target, Reese's car, the CIA lifeline Maya clung to. Crane dialed, his voice a snarl. Do it now. 2 miles away, Reese sped toward Maya, her Sadden weaving through the industrial maze, a team en route behind her. The bomb, a crude rig of C4 taped under the chassis, ticked down, its timer synced to Crane's wrath. Maya heard it before she saw it, a low boom rolling through the night, the sky flaring orange blocks away. She stumbled to her feet, her good hand clutching the wall, her eyes wide as a fireball bloomed over the rooftops. Smoke spiraled, thick and black, the blast's echo rattling the gas station's windows. Her burner buzzed again, a text from Crane. "You're next." Her knees buckled, the pipe clattering to the ground, her mind reeling. Reese was gone, her backup Ash, the CIA's, reach severed in a single strike. She'd saved Naya, knocked Crane cold, thought she'd won a breath. Now her world burned again, his revenge a sledgehammer she hadn't seen coming. She sank back, blood pooling beneath her, the city's hum a cruel mockery. Sirens wailed in the distance, too late, too far. She'd traded herself, taken his blows, and freed her sister. But Crane had turned it into a massacre. Her fractured arm hung useless, her ribs a cage of torment, her jaw swollen shut. She'd thought Nia's escape was the end, that she could regroup with Reese. The fireball told her otherwise. Crane's text glowed on the screen, a promise of more, his hatred a beast that wouldn't die. She clutched the burner, her vision blurring, the gas station's shadows swallowing her. She'd saved one life but lost another, and the war was far from over. Maya Jackson slumped against the gas station wall, her fractured arm a dead weight, her thigh a pulsing wound beneath blood-soaked rags, her ribs a jagged cage of pain. The fireball's glow faded over the city's industrial sprawl. Reese's car, a smoldering wreck 2 miles away. Crane's text, "You're next," a venomous echo in her skull. Her jaw throbbed, swollen from his crowbar, her hoodie a tattered shroud clinging to her battered frame. Nia was safe, whisked away by a CIA unit, but Reese's death carved a void, her lifeline severed in a blast of flame and steel. She staggered, to her feet, the night air cold against her fevered skin, her burner clutched in her good hand. Crane had taken everything, but she'd take it back, piece by bloody piece. She moved through the shadows, her limp a grim rhythm on the cracked pavement. The city's hum a distant drone. Her target, the precinct, Crane's fortress of corruption, a squat brick building 5 miles away. She'd hit him there, plant evidence to bury him deeper than the feds could. She stopped at a pawn shop, its windows barred, and traded her last. 20 for a janitor's uniform, its grey fabric loose over her wounds. She stole credentials from a dumpster behind a bar, a faded ID with a blurry photo close enough to pass. Her arm screamed as she pulled the uniform on, but she gritted her teeth, her training a steel thread holding her together. She'd turn his own ground against him, a ghost in his machine. The precinct loomed under a bruised dawn sky, its lights buzzing, its parking lot dotted with patrol cars. Maya slipped in through a service door, the ID swiping her past a sleepy guard. Her hood swapped for a cap pulled low. The hall stank of coffee and bleach, voices murmuring behind closed doors. She moved fast, her limp masked by a mop she'd grabbed, her good hand slipping into her pocket for a USB drive loaded with forged files, photos of Crane at murder scenes, timestamps tying him to bodies buried years ago. She reached to records. From its lock a cheap tumbler she picked in seconds, her fractured arm trembling but steady. She plugged the drive into a terminal, uploading the lies, seeding them into case logs. Her breath shallow as the progress bar crept forward. She wiped the keyboard, her ribs a firestorm, and slipped out, planting a burner phone with Crane's. Voice clips from the factory bugs, under a desk in the bullpen. She hobbled to a break room, watching through a cracked door as a rookie found the phone, his eyes widening at the audio. "Cleaning the streets tonight," Crane's voice rasped, smug and clear. The precinct buzzed, internal affairs swooping in by noon, their suits sharp against the chaos. Maya watched from a hacked feed on a stolen tablet, holed up in a motel 6 blocks away, its walls peeling, its air thick with mildew. Crane was hauled in, his buzzed scalp gleaming, his snarl muffled as they cuffed him. She grinned, her split, lip stinging, thinking she'd finally pinned him. Internal affairs grilled him for hours, the forged evidence and audio, a noose tightening around his neck. She watched the feed, her thigh bandaged with motel towels, her ribs braced with a torn sheet. His face twisted, his fists clenched, but the suits didn't budge, their questions a relentless drum. She thought she'd won, that this was the end game. Justice in a concrete room, but Crane's allies didn't sleep. By dusk, City Hall cronies, a pack of elites with blood money to burn, staged a riot, a calculated chaos to spring him. Hundreds stormed the precinct, their shouts a war cry, Molotovs shattering windows, files blazing in the night. Maya's feed cut to static, her stomach dropping as smoke curled over the skyline. Crane emerged from the inferno, his cuffs gone, his grin feral, leading a militia of loyalists armed with rifles and rage. The precinct burned, evidence reduced to ash, internal affairs scattered. Maya's tablet clattered to the motel floor, her breath hitching, her plan a cinder in his hands. She'd thought she'd trapped him, that the system would hold. Now, he was free, a king of chaos, and she was the hunted again. She grabbed her bag, her fractured arm a throbbing weight, and checked the window, the city's glow a taunt beyond the glass. She thought she could rest, regroup. Then the floor shook, a low rumble swelling into a roar, and she knew he'd found her. Headlights pierced the motel's gloom, Crane's truck rolling into the lot, his militia spilling out, Molotovs in hand. "Burn it down!" he bellowed, his voice a thunderclap over their chants. Bottles flew, flames blooming fast, the motel's cheap walls catching like kindling. Maya bolted, her thigh a furnace of pain, her ribs cracking with every step. Smoke clawed her lungs, the heat searing her back as she reached the window, wrenching it open. She leapt, her good arm breaking her fall, landing hard on the pavement. Below, glass raining around her. The motel erupted, a fireball swallowing her last refuge, the militia's cheers a savage hymn. She stumbled into the night, her sneakers squishing with blood, her fractured arm dangling useless, her ribs a symphony of torment. Crane's truck idled, his silhouette a spectre in the flames, his laugh cutting through the crackle. She'd infiltrated his lair, planted the seeds of his ruin, thought internal affairs was her victory. But he'd turned it into war. His allies, a storm she couldn't outrun. She hobbled into an alley, the city's sprawl swallowing her, her breath ragged, her bag lost in the blaze. The precinct was ash, her evidence gone, and Crane was a phoenix, rising stronger. She'd hit him with everything, and he'd hit back with fire, leaving her nothing but the clothes on her back and the fight in her veins. Maya Jackson limped through the city's industrial maze, her fractured arm a throbbing pendulum, her thigh a bloody mess beneath tattered bandages, her ribs a jagged ache with every step. The motel's flames still flickered in her mind, Crane's. Militia a spectre of chaos, his truck a beast that wouldn't quit. Her hoodie hung in shreds, her stolen janitor's uniform lost in the blaze, leaving her in a scavenged jacket and slacks, stiff with grime. The precinct was ash, her evidence torched, but she wasn't done. She'd lure him to his grave, one last stand to end this war. She slipped into a rail yard, its deserted tracks a web of rust and shadow, the air thick with coal dust and silence. Her burner buzzed with a final charge, her plan a spark in the dark. She'd leaked fake intel through a snitch she'd cornered hours ago, a jittery junkie who owed Crane favors. "Tell him there's a witness at the rail yard," she'd rasped, pressing a knife to his throat. Midnight. Alone. The snitch had squealed, and now she waited, perched atop a freight car, its steel cold against her palms. She'd rigged the trap, a loose coupling pin, a chain draped across the tracks, a recorder taped under the car's belly. Her thigh pulsed, blood seeping through the fabric, but her eyes were steel, scanning the night. Headlights flared at the yard's edge, Crane's truck rolling in, its growl a predator's call. He stepped out, his buzzed scalp glinting under a floodlamp, a pistol in his hand, his militia nowhere in sight. She'd counted on his ego, and it delivered. "Come out, rat!" he bellowed, his voice bouncing off the cars, his boots crunching. Gravel. Maya slid down, her good hand gripping the chain, her fractured arm a dead weight. She stepped into the light, her limp stark, her jaw swollen from his crowbar days ago. "Right here," she said, her voice steady, daring him closer. He grinned, holstering his gun, his meaty fists flexing. "No backup this time," he sneered, stalking forward. "You're mine." She baited him, backing toward the freight, her eyes flicking to the pin. He lunged faster than his bulk suggested, and she yanked the chain, the car rolling free, its door slamming shut behind him as he stumbled inside. The coupling locked, trapping him, his roar muffled by steel. She climbed atop the car, her ribs screaming, and pounded the roof, her recorder humming below. "Talk, Crane," she shouted, her voice a whip. "Tell the world what you've done." He raged, kicking the walls, but she taunted him, her words sharp. "The smuggling, the murders, the kid you beat. Say it." His fury broke, his voice spilling out raw and unfiltered. "Yeah, I run this city. Cash, guns, bodies, it's all mine. That kid got what he deserved, just like you will." She grinned, blood trickling from her lip, the recorder catching every word. She synced it to her burner, broadcasting live to every news outlet in range, her signal a flare in the night. "You're finished," she whispered, thinking she'd won. The city's screens lit up, Crane's confession blaring from bar TVs to factory break rooms, his voice a noose tightening around his neck. She watched the feed on her burner, perched on the car, the flood lamp casting her shadow long and fierce. Sirens wailed in the distance, feds closing in, her trap sprung. She'd lured him, caged him, and aired his sins, a final blow to his empire. She thought it was over, that justice would hold this time. But Crane's militia didn't sleep. They'd tailed him, a dozen armed shadows lurking beyond the yard, waiting for his signal. As the sirens grew louder, they struck, a storm of gunfire, and chaos shattering her victory. Bullets ripped through the air, punching holes in the freight car, sparks flying as Maya dove for cover. The militia swarmed, their rifles blazing, a coordinated ambush to free their king. She rolled behind a stack of ties, her thigh a furnace of pain, her fractured arm useless. A crony blasted the car's lock with a shotgun, the door swinging. Open, and Crane stumbled out, bloodied but alive, his grin a twisted mask. "You're dead," he roared, snatching a pistol from a lackey. The feds screeched into the yard, their SUVs fishtailing, but the militia met them, a hail of bullets, pinning them back. Maya crawled, her breath ragged, the recorder lost in the chaos, her broadcast cut short by static. Crane spotted her, his eyes wild and charged, his gun raised. She scrambled, her good hand clawing gravel, her ribs a symphony of torment. He fired, the shot cracking through the night, and pain erupted in her leg, the bullet tearing through her calf. She collapsed, blood pooling fast, her vision spotting as he loomed over her. "This city's mine," he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss, his gun trembling with rage. She'd trapped him, aired his truth, thought the sirens were her salvation. But his militia turned it into a war zone, their gunfire a wall between her and the feds. She lay there, her leg a ruin, her body a wreck, his shadow swallowing her. The yard was a battlefield, smoke curling through the air, the feds' shouts, drowned by the militia's barrage. Crane's men held the line, their loyalty a fortress, his freedom a prize they'd die for. Maya's blood soaked the gravel, her breath shallow, her burner buzzing uselessly in her pocket. She'd lured him, caged him, broadcast his downfall, and thought she'd won the day. But he'd flipped it, his ambush a sledgehammer to her hope. The sirens wailed, closer but not close enough, and Crane stood over her, his grin a promise of death. She'd given everything, and he'd taken it, all leaving her bleeding out in the dirt, the fight slipping from her grasp. Maya Jackson lay sprawled on the rail yard's blood-soaked gravel, her leg a mangled ruin where Crane's bullet had torn through, her fractured arm limp, her ribs a shattered cage leaking air. The city's industrial sprawl loomed, its smokestacks silent witnesses to her fall, the air thick with gunpowder and despair. Victor Crane towered over her, his buzzed scalp gleaming under the flood lamp, his pistol steady in his meaty hand, his militia's cheers a savage chorus behind him. "You're done?" he growled, his voice a low rumble, his grin feral as he cocked the hammer. Bullets still cracked through the yard, his men pinning the feds behind their SUVs, their sirens a futile wail. She'd trapped him, broadcast his sins, thought the cavalry would save her. Now her blood pooled, her breath faltered, and his shadow swallowed her whole. The militia roared, their rifles blazing, a wall of fire holding the feds at bay. Crane's eyes glinted, his finger tightening on the trigger, savoring the kill. She'd fought him across weeks of hell, from torn skirts to torched safehouses, her every strike met with his brutal return. She stared up, her vision blurring, her good hand clawing the dirt, defiance flickering in her chest. She'd given everything, lured him here, aired his rot to the world. It wasn't enough. He'd won. His city, his throne, her life, his trophy. She braced for the shot, her breath a ragged whisper, thinking this was the end. But the broadcast hadn't just hit newsrooms, it had pinged a CIA satellite, a live feed she'd looped into her agency's grid days ago, a failsafe she'd forgotten in the haze of pain. A whine split the sky, high and sharp, cutting through the gunfire's din. Crane froze, his head tilting, confusion flashing across his face. The militia faltered, their cheers dying as shadows streaked overhead. Maya's eyes flicked up, her heart stuttering, and she saw them. Drones, 3 black specks against the night, their engines a banshee's scream. The CIA hadn't abandoned her. They'd watched, waited, and now struck. Missiles rained down, precise and merciless, slamming into the yard with deafening booms. The first hit Crane's truck, a fireball erupting, metal twisting into a molten wreck. The second tore through his militia, bodies flung like dolls, their screams swallowed by the blast. The third found Crane, his pistol flying as the explosion consumed him, his buzzed scalp vanishing in a storm of flame and dust. The yard became a crater, smoke billowing thick and black, the flood lamp shattering in the shockwave. Maya rolled, her leg a dead weight, her good arm shielding her face as debris rained down. Heat seared her skin, gravel biting her wounds, but she crawled, her breath a choking gasp. The militia's gunfire ceased, their line obliterated, the eye. Feds' SUVs rocking from the blasts. She dragged herself behind a rusted railcar, her blood slicking the ground, her body a wreck of pain and will. The drones circled once, their whine fading, and then silence fell, broken only by the crackle of flames and the groan of settling steel. She'd thought Crane had her, that his bullet was her end. Instead, the sky had answered, her hidden ace, turning defeat into annihilation. She slumped against the car, her vision spotting, her chest heaving. The feds crept forward, their shouts distant, their flashlights cutting through the haze. She saw Crane's remains, a charred husk amid the wreckage, his empire ash in seconds. Her burner buzzed, its screen cracked but alive, a message from an unknown source. Threat neutralized, extract en route. She'd survived barely, her foresight with the live feed a lifeline she hadn't known she'd need. The feds wouldn't find her. She'd vanish before they closed in, a ghost in their chaos. She pulled herself up, her leg dragging, blood pooling beneath her, and hobbled into the shadows, the city swallowing her once more. By morning, the news spun wild, the rail yard a smoldering scar. Crane's confession replaying on every channel, his death a headline no one could twist. Corrupt cop and militia wiped out in mystery strike, the anchors blared, her photos of cash and guns flashing, alongside drone footage leaked from nowhere. The city reeled, factory workers whispering, barflies staring into their beers, the truth a hammer shattering Crane's myth. Maya's mugshot vanished, replaced by speculation, a vigilante, a fed, a phantom who'd dismantled a kingpin and faded. She watched from a safe house miles away, a CIA medic stitching her leg, her fractured arm splinted, her ribs taped tight. She'd orchestrated it all, her trap a lure, her broadcast a trigger, her survival a secret etched in blood. The medic worked in silence, her wounds a map of the war she'd fought. Her thigh was a mess of torn muscle, her ribs cracked but holding, her jaw a swollen bruise she could barely move. She'd lost everything, her safe houses, her sisters, peace, her handler's life, but she'd taken more. Crane's power, his network, his life. The world thought she was dead. The drones strike her tombstone, and she let them. She'd vanish, a myth whispered in the city's underbelly, a warning to those who'd follow him. The medic finished, handing her a new burner, its screen blank but alive. "You're off the grid," he said, his voice low. "Good luck." She nodded, her breath steady, the pain a dull hum she'd carry forever. She slipped out as dusk fell. The cities sprawl a muted glow beyond the safehouse window. Her limp was stark, her body a wreck, but her eyes burned with a quiet fire. The church bells rang in the distance, their toll a solemn note over the factory's hum, a sound she'd heard through weeks of hell. She paused, letting it wash over her, a moment of peace in the storm she'd survived. Then she walked on, her jacket flapping in the wind, her figure fading into the horizon. Crane was gone, his city free, her war won at a cost no one would know. She'd been a temp, a target, a fugitive, and now a legend, alive yet erased, her mission etched in the silence she left behind. This story of Maya Jackson's relentless fight against Victor Crane reveals profound truths about resilience, justice, and the cost of standing up to systemic evil. First, it shows that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to push through it. Maya faced brutal racism, physical torment, and betrayal, yet she never surrendered, turning every setback into a stepping stone. Her journey teaches us that one person's resolve can spark change, even against overwhelming odds. Second, it exposes the deep rot of unchecked power. Crane's corruption wasn't just personal, it was a network, thriving on fear and silence, reminding us that injustice festers where accountability fails. Third, the story underscores the price of victory. Maya lost her safety, her sister's peace, and her handler's life, a stark lesson that justice often demands sacrifice. Finally, her transformation into a myth highlights the power of legacy. By outsmarting Crane and vanishing, she became a symbol, proving that truth can outlast even the fiercest oppression. The takeaway: stand firm, speak out, and fight smart, because evil only wins when good people break. Maya's story isn't just a tale, it's a call to question the systems around us and act when they fail. What do you think? Could you face Crane's wrath like Maya did? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit like if her grit inspires you, and subscribe for more tales of defiance. Share this if you believe justice deserves a voice. Thanks for joining this wild ride. Here's wishing you the strength to challenge wrong wherever you find it.